Hey, welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. So it's been a bit since I've posted. I've been on vacation and just generally getting into the swing of things for summertime. But it's time to get back at it. And I'm going to get back at it with a year list of my top 15 favorite albums. This time for 1994, which is quite a change from 1973 in a lot of ways. Originally, when 1994 was happening, I was alive and experiencing music, unlike 1973, of course. So it does bring a little bit of a different perspective looking back. But I was very young too, and I was really only just getting into music. So what I was listening to then was quite different than a lot of the things that I respond to now, of course. Some of these albums have been with me for a long time, maybe not as far back as 1994, but at least since the later 90s or early 2000s and stuff like that. So that does change things a little bit. But also, I found, much like 1984, there wasn't a ton of new discoveries for me. There were more, I think, in 1994 compared to 1984, but it was still, I don't want to say like it was disappointing because I don't know that it really was. When I look back on it, it felt like it at the time. But when I look back, I did find some really cool albums that I really like and that I'm glad to have found. But there is a bit of a nature to the 90s that make album deep dives, they're just different than they are in the 70s. Because in the 70s, it was very album focused. Things were often, that was the focus on the pieces of art that they were making a lot of the time. I mean, not with everything, of course, but like the focus was to make a cohesive album, to make, something that fits on a record. So it's a digestible length, usually, unless it's a double album, but usually there was intention behind a double album. Whereas in the 90s, it was the CD era. So we were stuffing as much music as possible on CDs, and a lot of the albums are longer when maybe they didn't always need to be, because that was the standard. And I know myself as a young person, I expected the CD to have more music on it. I expected an album to have like 15 songs. Even if I didn't like all 15 songs, I expected it. So I get where it comes from, but it doesn't make for great deep diving. As a like looking at a year as a whole, it makes for a lot of bloated albums that don't need to be as long as they are because there's filler on a lot of them. So it kind of ended up where I ended up listening to my standard for this type of this year, like a 90s year would be 150 albums. I ended up exceeding that. I got in the 160s. But there was a lot more albums that I would say fall in more into the decent range, like the 3-star range this year, because they were just too bloated. There was filler. They were too long. And when I say too long, it's not just about length, it's about how you feel listening to it. So there can be long albums that don't feel too long. So it's not just about that number, but it's about the feeling. And there's definitely plenty of albums here in 1994 that fit into that too long, felt too long sort of thing. Maybe with a few good songs or okay songs, but as a full listening experience was just like, okay, like this is too much. So that clouded the year a bit, especially when I was in the midst of the deep dive. But I will say that looking back on it, it's a little more favorable than it felt at the time. There's still, my top albums are very strong. I love a lot of them. Some of them have been with me for many years. So it's not like it's a terrible year. It's just the deep dive experience is always a little different in this era than it is in other more album focused eras. I think it's just the brass tacks of how it works. But the nice thing about 1994 that was kind of cool is there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of stuff happening. I don't always like all of it, but there was a lot of there was industrial, there was trip hop, there was the golden era of hip hop, arguably. There was some lots of grunge, of course, or whatever you want to call that, like that's divisive. Slacker rock, singer songwriter, like in the more alternative vein, I guess. Yeah, there's lots happening. But, I didn't love all of it, but it made for a lot to check out and a lot to try out. So that's always fun. Anyway, into the list. I'm going to go with my top 15 as usual. I did make a top 25 list. So some of the albums that just missed my top 15, but were in my top 25, have behind me here. I have the Mavericks and What a Crying Shame. They kind of a special country act for the time, a little more I'm recalling like Roy Orbison and like a more classic sound, and I really like that about them. The Smoking Popes, there's a bit of a glare because the insert's kind of water damaged, but yeah, so that they're tagged often as pop punk, but I don't really feel them as much of a pop punk band. I think there's more to them than that. The singer kind of reminds me of Morrissey, as he reminds most people. And as a big Smiths fan, that's always a draw. But they have really catchy songs, cool album, very short, nice and digestible. Holes lived through this, which as time goes on, it's less and less my favorite album by them, but it was very important to me growing up. So there's always an attachment to it. And then we have Purple by Stone Temple Pilots, who are a band that get way more disrespect than they deserve. I think they have some great stuff. And they were doing a lot of different things than people realize. And I've been getting more into all their albums the last little while, and I've been very impressed. Like I always liked them a lot, but I got a new respect for them over the last little while. But anyway, all those sort of fall outside of my top 15 in that 16 to 25 range. So into the list proper, I'm starting with a new discovery for me for the dive. It's number 15 is by Freddie Johnston, and it's called This Perfect World. One thing I really liked about this album is that it kind of feels timeless. It feels like it could be from any time period sort of surrounding this. Like there's nothing that ties it to this time period, especially. It's kind of like a classic singer-songwriter kind of album. There is sort of like a poppy tinge to it, but also a little bit of country tinge, not like a big one, but like a little bit of like a maybe more Americana. It's just he writes really lovely songs, and they're all very memorable and catchy. Like after listening to it one or two times, you can have some of the melodies in your head, and like the lyrics are interesting, and it's just a really solid singer-songwriter album. And that's not something that you see a lot of, not in this style, I guess. I think a lot more of the singer-songwriter kind of stuff happening. A lot of it was very female-based, I find, like that kind of alternative sort of Liz Phair kind of realm, which doesn't always work for me. But yeah, that is kind of more what was happening in that sort of range. But this kind of takes it back, kind of recalls like an earlier time, I think, but it still sounds modern. Like it doesn't sound like it's totally out of time or anything. So it was just a really cool discovery, a really solid album. Number 14 is by another very consistently solid artist for me, someone who often makes lists when I'm doing year-end dives, and that's Nick Lowe, with The Impossible Bird. So this one's quite different for him too, because it has again like a bit of a more of an Americana kind of country vibe, but I'd say more of a classic country vibe. It in some ways it kind of reminds me a little bit of like some Willie Nelson, sort of the style of songwriting and the way he's singing. He doesn't sound like Willie Nelson, of course, he sounds like Nick Lowe, but there's just sort of this tinge to it that's what it makes me think of. He does a few covers on here, but the best one of those would be True Love Travels on a Gravel Road. I love his version of that song, and that's the song I knew before getting into this album. The album itself was new to me in the dive as well. But that song I've been familiar with for several years. It's always been a favorite. I found it, I don't know, kind of randomly, I think. Title just gave it to me one day and I was like, oh, this is awesome. This is totally different than some of the Nick Lowe that I'd heard up to that point. So I just really fell in love with it. And it is a good indicator of the rest of the album. It's sort of similar style. And I like him doing this style. It's quite different than, the power pop or pub rock kind of stuff that he's more known for, I think. But he excels. I think the songs that he writes really fit into this style on this album, and I think the covers are well chosen. He did the original of "The Beast in Me" that was covered by Johnny Cash, I think the same year, is also here. So it's cool to hear his original because I was familiar with Johnny Cash's version first. So yeah, just another solid release from the always reliable Nick Lowe. And he's got a new one coming this year, which I'm really excited to see what he's got up his sleeve because it's been a long time. So number 13, going on to some of the stuff I actually own on CD because I have no records for 1994, which is fitting. I have Without a Sound by Dinosaur Jr. So I think over the years, I've known Dinosaur Jr. for a long time, but mostly really focused on their 80s output because it seems like people put a lot of respect on that time period and then sort of gloss over the 90s, which is a mistake. Their 90s albums are awesome. And I did a deep dive of them a couple years ago for another video I did on the channel. And I was really quite surprised by how great all those 90s albums are compared to the opinion about them sort of in the broader spectrum of, I don't know, internet opinion or critical opinion or whatever, I don't know. But we've been sleeping on them. They're all great. This is actually my least favorite of the four from the 90s, but it's still an awesome album. There's some great songs here. Jay Mascis always writes really good songs at the very least, like even on his solo albums, and as well as all the Dinosaur Jr. stuff, they're always at least good. So most of the time they're great or better. So this album is no exception. It has, I think, what ended up being their biggest commercial breakthrough with Feel the Pain. But there's lots of great songs on here. Like I Don't Think So is awesome. Always gets stuck in my head. On the Brink, Over Your Shoulder. Like there's lots of great songs on this album. So yeah, check it out if you're sort of stuck in that hole, you're living all over me bug, and that's it. There's way more to Dinosaur Jr. than that. So yeah, check it out. Number 12 is on a totally different vein and really quite different for me. And it's Portishead and Dummy. So I say it's different for me because I am not really a big trip hop person overall. I've learned over the years. It's not really my thing as a genre, I would say. And it's become, I think it's kind of reemerged a little bit in trends the last few years. I've noticed a lot more people kind of going back to it and talking about it favorably. So it's caused me to re-explore the genre, and it still overall doesn't work for me. But Portishead, I've always loved. Even, I mean, for many years, over 20 years probably, found them in high school. I've always really responded to just their vibe. There's like a mystery and like a film noirish vibe to their music that's really appealing and really cool, I think. And Beth Gibbons' vocals, I mean, also elevate things for me. I really like her as a vocalist, but I just really like stylistically what they do with the genre. I feel like they kind of do their own thing with it. Not to say that other artists don't too. It's just that those variations of it don't necessarily resonate with me, but Portishead does. And this is actually my least favorite of their albums, but I still think it's great. Like their albums are all sort of consistently on a very high level for me. So when I say it's my least favorite, it's still awesome. But I just like the way that they use samples and sounds to build out almost like a universe or like a world. Like they feel like you're kind of sucked into the Portishead vibe, and I think that's really awesome. So that is my number 12. Number 11 is Bake Sale by Sebadoh. This is an album I found in my early 20s, I would say. I was super into it for a long time. It's also sort of related to Dinosaur Jr. because Lou Barlow, of course, who formerly and then later was of Dinosaur Jr., was part of Sebadoh. That was his solo project, aside from them. And at this point, he wasn't part of the band, but he was doing his own thing. And it's got its own vibe. I mean, Lou always had his own songwriting vibe apart from Jay. So that this is on display here. It has some really cool songs on it. It's just a solid album in that what often gets called the slacker rock realm. I just like the songs on it overall. I always listen to it a lot. Um, the last song, Together or Alone, is actually my favorite on it, but there's lots of great ones like Not Too Amused, License to Confuse gets stuck in my head all the time. Just a solid album. Number 11, Sebadoh. Number 10 is a relatively new discovery for me in the dive, and that is John Henry by They Might Be Giants. Was sort of familiar with the band before. I knew some of the bigger songs and I knew some of their kids' stuff just because my kids listened to it and the stuff that they did with the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. Kids watched that a lot when they were growing up. So I had a familiarity, but I don't think that I realized that they were more than just the quirky stuff I knew about them. Like they're really good pop songwriters as well as they do the quirky thing, but it's like the kind of quirky that's enjoyable, that's really cool, that I like. Like it's not that stuff, it doesn't go into the realm of being annoying, which sometimes that sort of thing can. They don't. I think that they manage that balance really well. And this album actually pretty well blew me away the first time I heard it. I was like, wow, this is a really cool, really great album. Like I saved lots of songs from it. I've gone back to it several times. And I just think that they're a band that I would like to explore further in the future. I've heard a few albums since then and I've really liked them, but I'd like to listen to everything and really get a full assessment. But John Henry was a great place to start. It's an awesome album and one that I will keep going back to. So that is number 10. Number 9 is somebody who appeared on the 1984 list, and that is the Meat Puppets with Too High to Die. Now, this is interesting because there are a lot of people that love Two and love their 80s stuff, but think that they kind of fall off in this era. And I just really cannot agree with that at all. I think that they are still making great music here. Like all the songs are very catchy and I think they're memorable. Yes, they're more polished. They're not scrappy. There's that youthfulness maybe is not quite there the same way, but they're 10 years older. So of course they're going to grow up. And yes, it's a major label, but that doesn't take away the talent that the artists have. Like, I think that often is this sort of thing with these artists that start out in the underground and become underground darlings. It's like there's this view that once they get on a major label, suddenly they change or like suddenly they're not as good anymore. And I just don't. It gets really ridiculous sometimes. And it's a viewpoint that I'm kind of tired of. And I think that some of the complaints to do with the Meat Puppets come from that. Maybe not everyone. Maybe people just do not respond to what they're doing here. It is a little more polished. I get that. But I still think that they are them. I still think that there's a lot about their sound that's still present here. And it's just more refined, I think. So yes, I love the old stuff. I love this. I don't see where there should be a difference. So that rant being said, I would say that yeah, Too High to Die makes my top 10 in 1994 and it belongs there. So number 8 is Crooked Rain by Pavement. Another band that I found when I was in high school. They really kind of changed a lot for me. It was a new sound. And I think in the 90s, yeah, it was a new sound anyway, but it was really a new sound for me growing up in a small town. I don't know. Like I was exposed to more music than I think a lot of people would have been in that same setting because my dad did have a used music store. So I did hear a lot of different things and he was kind of into discovering some different things. He was into grunge and he was into like a lot of the stuff happening at the time, which maybe a lot of my peers, their parents were not. I remember they definitely were not into the stuff my dad was into. So that helped me find things. But even still, even with all that considered, Pavement was really special to me when I heard them. It was a new sort of sound and just something really cool. And I really responded to that. I would say that I think that Slanted and Enchanted would have been the first album by them I heard, but Crooked Rain is also very special to me. The thing is, I change all the time which ones are my favorite by them. Sometimes it's Bright in the Corners, sometimes it's Slanted and Enchanted. Crooked Rain always kind of falls into that like probably number 2 or number 3 tier. But I still think it's awesome. I still think it's great. It's full of these memorable songs that never leave my mind, like Stop Breathing and Cut Your Hair and all those great songs. And they're doing more on here than I think they often get credit for. People make it sound, oh, they're slacker rock, blah, 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 blah. It's this, whatever. But no, they're doing things like something like 5 minus 4 equals unity is a little more jazzy and it's an instrumental. Like, I don't think that necessarily fits into this whole like lack of ambition sort of thing that people try to portray. Yes, that is sort of like the vibe or whatever, but I think that really minimizes what they're doing. I think they're doing a lot more than that. And I think also like on Stop Breathing, there's this solo part near the end that reminds me of a Can song. And when I first heard it, the Can song, I was like, whoa, that reminds me of the Pavement song. So like there's a lot more happening than I think people give them credit for. So, I mean, not to say that they don't get credit because they are a beloved band. I mean, I guess I'm maybe preaching to the converted here, but they do have their haters. I know that for sure. I know some of them, but yeah, Crooked Rain, it's great. Number 7 is an album that was strangely actually new to me as well in this dive, and that is Wildflowers by Tom Petty. As a full album, it was new to me. I mean, I knew a lot of songs on it already, and for just whatever reason, I never got to it, but it blew me away. I absolutely loved it. And it kind of makes me think of like when I'm saying, oh, in the 90s, the albums were too long and they were full of filler. This is a long album, but it's not like that. It's not full of filler. All of these songs are great. This is a 15 song album. That should be a 15-song album. I don't think there's a wasted song here. And I think that, yes, there's a lot of songs that you recognize and that you know. Actually, there were more on here than I realized that I knew. But there's all those other songs on there are just as great and at the same level. And I just really responded to them immediately. And it's an album that I can see even growing in my estimation the more I get to know it over the years. The blend of the more subdued sort of sound, it's different for him from what he was doing before with the Heartbreakers, but I still think that it's a logical progression and his songwriting is always top notch. Like I recently did a deep dive of his discography, and one thing that's just completely blown me away about him is how consistent he was with his just the level of his songwriting. Like even on the albums that aren't as good, there's always great songs. Like yes, there's some clunkers. I mean, overall, a huge career. You're gonna have a misstep here and there, or like production styles will not necessarily hold up or whatever, or suit you. But he always had great songs throughout his career. So not a lot of people can say that. And this album is a combination of that. Like it's just a great album. So that is my number 7. But now for the rest of the albums, we're getting into the stuff that I've known a long time and has been close to my heart in some ways for a long time. Number 6, we're going with my only live album, and that is Unplugged in New York by Nirvana. Of course, growing up in the 90s, Nirvana were incredibly important. The same old story. It's almost a cliche, but what sometimes things are true for a reason. And I just love what they did with their songs on this effort. Like, I think the way that they stripped back the songs and made it work is just kind of amazing. Like, not everybody could do that the way that they did. It's not just about these songs being loud. It kind of showed the strength of Kurt's songwriting and that he was able to do them, some of these, in a completely different style and make them better in some cases. Like, some of these songs on here are my favorite versions of the songs. Like, I prefer this version of All Apologies. I prefer this version of Penny Royalty. So, like, I think that this is just one of those special live albums where they take the songs, they do something different with them, and it makes it shine on its own. Like, it's not just like a document of a concert. And I mean, there's lots of live albums like that. Don't get me wrong. This is not like singular in that sense, but it is up there for me. And it is just one of those, just an album that I can put on anytime. And I prefer to some of their studio albums. So, not a lot of people have those. Anyway, and it's also was my first exposure to the Meat Puppets, who also made this list, of course. 3 of their classic songs are on here. And I think it was a lot of people's introduction to the Meat Puppets. Number 5 is by Tori Amos, and it's Under the Pink. Sorry, I got stuck to the CD next to it. Tori Amos was a very important artist for me as growing up as a teenager. I first found her 1998 album From the Choir Girl Hotel when it came out, and it just kind of changed a lot of things for me. It was a very different style of songwriting than I was used to, because I was more into, like, I guess, the grunge, post-grunge, whatever, rock music of the time, or like some of the pop music, whatever. But this sort of songwriter, emotional, bare bones sort of thing was not something that I was used to. From the female driven stuff was more like Hole for me, or Veruca Salt, those sort of things, more in a rock realm. And Tori is not so much in the rock realm. She's more, I don't know, she's more her own thing. She gets compared to Kate Bush a lot, and I mean, I get it, but I still think she's doing her own separate version of that. I mean, obviously vocally they're fairly similar, but I think they are doing different things at the end of the day. She has a very singular lyrical voice. Nobody can write lyrics the same way, because she's just kind of in her own little world with that. But even back then, I was able to relate that stuff to my life. For weird lyrics, I was able to relate it back to me. And that was very important at a time when I was, very young. So I found this album a couple years after 1994, of course, but not too long after. And it was just very important to me growing up. And it still resonates. It's still like some of my favorite Tori songs, like Baker Baker, are on this album. And it's just a really special album, but still only 90 or number 5 of the year. Number 4 is probably my favorite Guided by Voices album, B1000. Now, Guided by Voices is an interesting one, because I found them, I don't know, in the mid 2000s at some point. And at first I was just like, yeah, this is cool. But then, I don't know, something happened, and the little fragmentary songs started to get their hooks in me. And like, I'd be sitting around and I'd suddenly start singing one of these silly songs. Like, it's very lo-fi, very weird lyrics sometimes. But there's just something about it that once you get it, it sticks with you and you get it. Like, I don't know, it's weird. I don't know if I can really explain it, but at first I was not super impressed. But over time, it became an album I really loved and really stuck with me. I wouldn't say that everything they've ever done has that same quality, because of course they've made many, many albums, and they continue to make many, many albums to varying degrees of success for me. But this one is just one that I really love, as well as their next one, Alien Lanes, kind of falls into that. I think in the late 90s, they did some cool stuff too. Number 3 is Vitology, and this is actually my favorite Pearl Jam album. They have a lot of great albums, and I like them a lot, but there's something about this one where you can tell they're just doing whatever the hell they want at this point. Like they've had their success in their big arena, like album with 10 and like the songs that you still hear on the radio all the time. And Versus was, a little more harder edge, but still sort of in a similar vein. But in this album, I don't know. They mix it well still. I mean, there's still songs that you hear on the radio on this album. You hear Better Man all the time and stuff like that. But there's just something about the attitude and the songs here that just excite me just a tiny bit more than Verses or 10, or anything after it as well. Even though I also really like a lot of the albums after it. I like No Code a lot. I like Yield a lot. As it goes on, I think their career is a lot more solid than people like to say sometimes. Like it's not just about the early stuff. Like they continue on mostly making at least good or very good albums. Vitology is still my favorite by them. So it is number 3 of 1994. Number 2 is Weezer by Weezer, or the Blue Album, as we all call it. This album sort of runs counter to a lot of the rock that's happening in 1994. It's a lot more fun. Like it's just a fun power pop album. And it wasn't the only thing that brought power pop back into the 90s, because that was already happening. But I think this is the one that maybe was one of the more popular ones. And even hearing the songs from it as a kid, because I did hear the singles from this early on. Like I was aware of Buddy Holly when it was coming out, and Say It Ain't So, and Undone, the Sweater Song. Like I was aware of all those songs in 94, 95. So it always felt something a little bit different from everything else that was happening. And I think that freshness has helped it really continue on to be something that feels timeless. Like there's something about it that feels separate from the time that it came from. I don't know if that makes sense, but like also brings you back to the 90s. I don't know. But it's a very exciting pop album. I love the songs on it. The singles are great, but of course, there's a lot of other songs here that I like even more. Like Surf Wax America is my favorite song on the album. Total. Like it's just such a fun, I don't know. It always makes me feel great when I hear it. Like I always feel like I want to go surfing, and I don't surf. And it's actually looks kind of terrifying, but this song makes me wish that I was surfing. So that's pretty special. And In the Garage is another favorite. I just love that feeling of like being where you feel safe and happy. And I think the song evokes that so well. And yeah, it's just fantastic. And of course, they would go on to have a very interesting career. Pinkerton, their next album, is actually my favorite Weezer album. I like it just a little bit more than this one, but they're pretty close. But after that, it gets a little more dodgy. But at least we have this, and at least we have Pinkerton. So that's better than some bands can say. So that's number 2 of the year. But number 1 is Grace by Jeff Buckley. I wish we'd gotten more from him. This is just such a beautiful album, and his singing is just so emotional and just so top notch. Like, I don't know. Like, I first became aware of him sometime I'd say around 2003 to 2004, when I heard his cover of Hallelujah. And that was really my introduction to that song. I wouldn't say that I really was familiar with that song that I'm aware of before that. Because at that point I hadn't gotten into Leonard Cohen yet. And I don't know that, and from what I've read, it was not considered a highlight of the album really until it was sort of revamped into a classic and has become like a complete juggernaut in the years since. But anyway, at that point, it wasn't that yet. I was just hearing Jeff Buckley's version and I just was so blown away. I think even still, I think his version is really the definitive version of the song for me. But it's not just about that. The rest of this album is full of great songs, his originals and other covers that he does. He just brings everything into every song and he owns every song, whether it's his own composition or not. There's just something special about the way that he performed music that he becomes the song in a way, and you really feel that and it really comes through. And I think that is where I wish we had more. Unfortunately, obviously he died young and we didn't get to really hear what else he had in store. But this album is so special and I'm so glad that we at least have this. I mean, obviously there's some other stuff that we have that he recorded in between. But there's just something about the statement of this album that just elevates it above even all this other stuff I love this year, you know? It's just, yeah, it's just the number one album of the year, a special album in a year full of, I'd say, pretty special albums. So, yeah, that is my 1994 list. Again, as usual, I know I missed some big ones. So, yeah, just if you have a list or if you have favorites, just drop them in the comments. I always like to see them. Let me know what I missed. Of course, people always do, and that's always cool. I like seeing it. So sometimes I find something new from it. So that's always fun. Even though the dive is done, listening is never done. I'm always looking for something new. But anyway, that's enough for me. I will drop my full 25 at the end of the video as I always do. Yeah, till next time. Bye.